Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into a really interesting piece. It's titled, Disciple Makers Realize How Hard Completing the Great Commission Will Be for Strategies and Organizations Built Around Branded Christianity.
That's the title.
It is. And our mission, really, for this deep dive is just to unpack what the author's saying here, looking at the challenges they see for certain Christian approaches, in trying to reach the world. And we're sticking only to what's in this specific text.
Right. And it's definitely a critical look. The source, it argues that some established Christian institutions, maybe even their methods, could actually be getting in the way of the Great Commission, not really helping it along.
Okay, so let's start where the source starts. The author, David, along with Paul, they make a point right up front saying they're not anti-denomination or anti-church or anti-organization. They actually say they've worked within these systems.
Yeah, that framing is, I think, pretty important. They establish that they have this history, this experience. Yeah. It kind of signals, that this critique is meant as an inside perspective, maybe. Something they've seen firsthand, rather than just an attack from the outside.
Right, an internal critique. So coming from that perspective, what do they pinpoint as the core challenge for these organizations?
The source basically says that organizations pushing what they call a particular brand of Christianity, well, they're going to find it really hard, maybe impossible to complete the Great Commission.
Branded Christianity, okay, that's the term. How does the source actually define that? What does that look like on the ground, according to this text?
Well, they describe it as groups insisting that their affiliated churches all stick to a specific viewpoint. And this isn't just belief. It includes associated practices tied to the Bible, but also, and this seems key, their specific group history.
Group history, too.
Yeah. They say it's, Bible-based and history-based, and it demands different levels of sticking to the doctrine and the practices of that particular brand.
Okay, so it's more than just core beliefs. It's interpretations, specific ways of doing things, maybe historical traditions that become, requirements.
Exactly. And the source then links this idea directly to how these approaches handle the Bible, how they use Scripture.
Right. And what's the critique there? How do they see that relationship playing out?
They make a few pretty sharp points. They argue the doctrine that gets emphasized often feels like just a part of what Scripture says, maybe a subset, or sometimes they say it includes what they call extra-biblical teachings.
Extra-biblical, meaning?
Ideas based more on church history or tradition rather than directly from the Bible itself.
Ah, okay. History creeping in, that's a strong claim. What else do they say about the connection to the text?
They push it further. They call things like worship styles, leadership models, how churches are governed. They say these are mostly extra-biblical, even if people claim they're biblically based.
Mostly extra-biblical. Wow.
And importantly, the source says these groups sometimes actively, exclude or downplay Bible passages that don't quite fit their specific views.
Downplay passages. How does the source say they manage that?
They use this phrase, playing the interpretation game.
Okay.
Kind of implying the text is approached with the answer already decided, Instead of letting the text lead, they even claim some groups will just redefine passages as spurious, like false, or say, oh, that's not really Scripture, or maybe just that doesn't apply today.
Not relevant today. Yeah, that's one way to deal with tricky bits, I suppose. So if you put all that together, what's the source's main point about how tradition and history function here?
I think a key takeaway the source is driving at is that these historical, extra-biblical beliefs and practices, they sometimes get lifted up basically in the same level as Scripture itself.
Elevated to scriptural authority.
Yeah, whether it's said out loud or just happens in practice. The source suggests, look at the areas where an institution just won't budge, or where they criticize others harshly, those non-negotiables. They might show you where tradition has effectively become equal to Scripture for them.
So it sounds like the argument is that these maybe well-intentioned historical elements end up defining the brand so much that they can overshadow or even twist how Scripture is read, just to make it fit.
That seems to be exactly the concern, yeah. That the specific requirements of the brand become the lens through which everything else is viewed.
Okay. So given that structure, that focus on a specific brand, what does the source then say about the actual reach? How successful is this kind of Christianity at actually, bringing people in?
The source is pretty direct about this. They claim that if you look at attendance records, even in places like countries with state churches, where you might think numbers would be high,
Mm-hmm.
only a really small percentage of people actually
It's
go.
small percentage. How
Well,
small are we talking?
the source puts it at about 2 to 5% of the population maximum for any single brand.
2 to 5%.
And then they make this, well, pretty striking claim. Basically, everyone who wants to be part of a particular branded church,
Yeah.
they're already there.
Wow. Okay. That's like saying the market's totally saturated in business terms.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And what about everyone else, the ones not attending?
Right. What does the source say about them?
It says many people actively choose not to join branded Christianity. They might know a bit about it, have some exposure, but they just reject it. And even people who are technically members, maybe they only show up, Christmas and Easter, not regular involvement.
Okay. So if each brand only reaches this small slice and lots of others are opting out, what does the source conclude about the sort of historical track record of this whole approach?
Well, connecting those dots, the source points out, look, this kind of branded Christianity has been around for, 1,600 years?
Long.
Yeah. And they cite numbers like, best case, maybe 32% of the world calls themselves Christian. But then they immediately qualify that only about 20% of those people are regularly involved.
Oof. Okay. So the source's conclusion from that history and those numbers is?
It's presented almost like math. Keep doing the same thing, you get the same results. The source flat out says the approaches used since, say, the Protestant Reformation back in 1517, they just haven't worked to reach the whole world.
Haven't succeeded. And connected to that, this limited reach, these historical results, the source makes a really powerful, maybe even provocative statement about how Christianity is seen around the globe. What do they say?
They claim, quite bluntly, that Christianity does not have a good name in most of the world.
That's a heavy statement. Why? What reason does the source give for that perception?
The reason they give is, well, it's sharp. It says, we have made Christ like us, which is the vilest form of idolatry, instead of becoming like Christ.
Made Christ like us instead of becoming like Christ. Wow. So the source is arguing that the internal focus, the branding, the history, the specific practices, that's created an external image problem.
That's exactly the connection they seem to be making. And then they follow it up with this really challenging question, basically asking what makes us think anyone wants our religion. They've seen it in action and they've rejected it.
Right. So it links the internal critique to the external perception, the lack of appeal. It's building a case for why this approach might be stalling out.
Okay, so let's shift gears. There's another barrier the source brings up, right? What's the second big obstacle they identify?
Yeah, the second major hurdle they point to is leader training, specifically the processes of education and indoctrination. They call it a bottleneck.
A bottleneck, okay. And the result of this bottleneck is, what's the consequence, according to the source? The source argues that this bottleneck basically kills any hope of finishing the Great Commission before, another whole generation passes. They claim that all the seminaries, Bible schools, church networks, put them all together, they simply can't churn out enough leaders fast enough.
That's a huge claim, that the systems designed to create leaders are actually preventing the mission's completion.
Yeah, the source doesn't mince words. It says these denominational education processes make fulfillment impossible, at least in any kind of reasonable time frame.
Okay. And how does the source contrast this sort of long, potentially slow process with what they see happening back in the first century?
Ah, right. They bring up the first century leaders, describing them as, often illiterate fishermen, maybe rebels,
Yeah.
people who'd look totally unqualified by today's standards.
Right. Not exactly seminary grads.
Not at all. Yet, the source says these people went into new places, new groups, nations, cities. They started churches in a matter of months, apparently, and then they moved on, leaving these new believers to carry on the work.
So the source is highlighting what? Speed, simplicity, something lost compared to today.
Exactly that. The argument seems to be that we lost the simplicity, meaning all the complex educational tracks, the heavy organizational structures that grew over centuries, they actually slowed things down. They lost the ability to replicate leaders quickly and move effectively between different cultures. They even suggest that overtraining or overmanaging new believers can actually stop that replication process, hinder the kind of rapid spread they saw early on.
Sounds like they're saying the current systems are just too cumbersome, too slow compared to whatever the original model was, and they specifically challenge today's methods based on who Christ initially chose.
Yes, absolutely. They question the whole assumption that extensive formal training is the only way, or even the best way. Especially, I'd argue, since Christ himself picked and empowered leaders who looked, from the outside, pretty marginal or unprepared, at least according to the source's reading.
Okay, so if this branded Christianity, with its focus on specific doctrines, history, practices, and this long training process, if that's seen by the source as a major hindrance, what's the alternative? What solution does the source actually propose? They seem to point back to that first century model again.
They do. The alternative they put forward sounds quite simple on the surface. It's about giving people the gospel, teaching them to obey it.
Just that.
Well, then focusing on seeing them become genuinely faithful disciples. And here's a key part, leaving them to sort of wrestle with obeying the word in their own specific context, their own history.
Leaving them to struggle in their own context.
Yeah, that sounds very different from having to fit neatly into a prepackaged brand structure. It really does. And a core piece of this proposed shift is allowing these new groups of believers to develop their own unique ways of doing worship, leadership, governance, as long as it stays within the bounds of biblical obedience. The main thing is obeying the core message, not copying specific historical forms or organizational charts.
So the priority shifts entirely to gospel obedience and making disciples, and then you let the form of the church, the practices, kind of emerge naturally in that context, instead of imposing a historical brand from the outside.
That's precisely the shift the source seems to be advocating
Yeah.
for, yeah, based on their interpretation of how things worked in the first century.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. What's the source's final argument? What's their bottom line on how to actually move forward and complete the Great Commission?
The source basically concludes that finishing the task requires institutions to kind of forget their differences, forget their specific brands, at least as the main focus.
Set aside the brand.
Yeah. They argue the focus has to shift to just planting the gospel itself, not their specific doctrines or church models, and on making genuinely obedient disciples of Christ, rather than just, signing up converts for their particular brand.
Focus on the core message and obedient followers, not brand loyalty. And the source hints this might actually end up helping the brands too, paradoxically.
It does, yeah. The force suggests that if organizations adopt this focus, really prioritize gospel obedience, and serving people their own brand might actually grow and become more relevant as a result.
Yeah.
It's presented as this path where obeying the word in service helps both the larger mission and potentially their own vitality. Wow. This has been a really fascinating look into the source material. It lays out such a clear, if challenging, argument that these traditional branded approaches, defined by their specific histories, doctrines, structures, training the authors, sees them as fundamentally limited in reach, limited in effectiveness for the Great Commission.
Definitely.
And the alternative path they propose is quite a pivot, isn't it? It's a callback to something simpler, maybe more like the first century, focused purely on the gospel message, on biblical obedience, and trusting new believers to figure out the contextual practices within that obedience, rather than needing to import established traditions.
Yeah. It leaves us with a really powerful thought to chew on, straight from the source itself. And it's a big if the source poses. If making Christ look like us through our specific traditions and structures is a major barrier, well, how might things change? How might movements grow and spread differently if the focus shifted entirely to just becoming like Christ, driven only by obeying the gospel and allowing for that local contextual expression? What does it really mean day to day to prioritize gospel obedience over even cherished historical or organizational traditions? Definitely something to mull over.